Hey there. Tonight I want to begin with a list of kings scratched into clay, and with one very quiet shock. The first rulers of Sumer are said to have ruled not for years, not even for lifetimes, but for spans so vast they feel like weather moving across the face of deep time. Tens of thousands of years. Then, almost without warning, the numbers collapse. The rains become mortal. The gods turn their faces away. The temples fall silent, and somewhere in that silence, a whole civilization seems to realize that the old age is over. If that kind of ancient mystery is your kind of firelit journey, leave a like. Subscribe if you want to wander back here again. And now let the room soften around you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen. And let the clay tablets begin to speak. Imagine the candle beside us giving off that faint, warm smell of wax and smoke. The sort of smell that makes even a modern room feel older than it is. Imagine the last small sounds of the house fading into the walls. A floorboard settles. A distant car passes and is gone. Your breathing slows without needing permission. And now imagine a different room, far older, the stepped, far drier, where clay tablets lie under dust and silence, each one carrying wedge-shaped marks pressed there by hands that have been gone for thousands of years. The earliest Sumerian king lists begin in a tone that is almost matter-of-fact. That is one reason they feel so unsettling. They do not shout. They do not wave their arms. They simply record. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 800 years. Then others follow, measured not in seasons or decades, but in impossible reaches of time. Dumuzid of Bad Tibira, Centralo, 000 years. Enmenlu Anna, and rulers like him, each carried on the tablet with the same calm scribal precision. It is as if someone handed you a local town register, between one baker and the next, casually informed you that the mayor had remained in office since before your mountain range existed. Honestly, I have always found that more eerie than any dramatic myth. Numbers can feel colder than monsters. A monster at least makes noise. A column of impossible rain lengths just waits for you to notice it. If you were standing here with me in a museum archive, leaning slightly closer to a case of brown-fired clay under low-controlled light, you would see how ordinary the objects look. No thunder. No burning halos. Just tablets, chipped at the edges, dense with script, the color of old dust and river mud baked hard. And yet on those quiet surfaces is a whole theory of reality, a world in which the first rulers are not merely human kings, but something closer to divine administrators, beings whose relationship to time itself is different from ours. Then comes the turn. Without explanation, or at least without the explanation modern readers want, the rains shrink. No longer tens of thousands of years. No longer impossible ages. Suddenly kings begin to rule for spans that sound human. A few decades. A generation. Sometimes less. The list does not perform this shift like a poet announcing tragedy. It just does it. And that plainness is what makes it feel like a door closing. Some scholars would say the early rains are symbolic, mythic, dynastic exaggerations, numerological theology pressed into historical form. Others note that the shift is so abrupt, and so closely surrounded by language about divine favor departing that the old scribes may have understood themselves to be recording a real change in the structure of the world. We cannot be sure, and it is wise to move gently here. But even if one strips away every grand claim, the emotional fact remains. The king lists preserve a memory of a before and after. An age when rule felt divine. An age when it no longer did. That transition matters because Sumer was not a small imaginary place living only inside stories. These were city-states with granaries, canals, workshops, councils, taxes, shrines, scribes, and neighborhoods. Daily bread, mud brick walls, reed baskets, temple smoke in the morning, donkeys in the lanes, children growing up under the gaze of gods whose statues were treated as living presences. When the records begin implying that divine rule has receded, they are not only adjusting theology, they are watching the whole frame of ordinary life tilt. The phrase that hangs over this period in the source material is the divine withdrawal. That is a haunting phrase. Not destruction, not battle, withdrawal. It suggests not that heaven was overthrown, but that heaven stepped back, quietly, deliberately, perhaps permanently. You know that feeling when a person leaves a room and only afterward do you realize how much of the room had been organized around them. The chairs face their direction. The conversation had been following their tone. The silence after they go is larger than the sound they made while present. That is how this transition feels in the Mesopotamian sources. The gods are not described first as dying, or being defeated, or vanishing in smoke. They turn away. Their favor departs, and the human world begins to feel the absence almost at once. The city of Eridu, ancient even by ancient standards, is one of the names that deepens the mood. It was revered as the first city, the old southern place tied to Enki and the deep waters. A city so old that later Mesopotamians already looked back at it the way we look back at legendary beginnings. When the king lists start with Al-Ulim of Eridu, they are not just naming a location. They are planting us in sacred origin territory. The divine age begins there, near water, near the first order of things. And then the numbers shrink. I like to linger on that because it is the simplest and strongest hook in the whole story. Before we even touch abandoned temples, strange astronomical reports, or priests hearing voices in the sanctum, we already have the central wound. Time itself seems to change character. The old kings belong to deep time. The later kings belong to history. Something has happened in between, and the scribes leave us only enough to feel the chill of it. Picture one of those scribes for a moment, a reed stylus in hand, damp clay waiting on a board, sunlight in a narrow band across the floor. He presses sign after sign into the tablet with trained calm, repeating formulas inherited from older records. Kingship descended from heaven. Such and such a king ruled for an age that could swallow cities whole. Then later entries, shorter, leaner, more plausible. Did he feel the strangeness? Did he pause? Did the old impossible numbers already feel like memory by his time? Or did they still feel dangerously true? We do not know. But I suspect anyone copying those tablets while living in a world of ordinary mortality must have felt the contrast in his bones. The source script frames this shift as more than a scribal preference, and that is the right instinct for storytelling. It links the king list transition to phrases in later tablets about the gods turning their faces away and divine favor departing from the land. If those phrases had appeared alone, one might file them under the usual poetry of ancient lament. But paired with the numbers, paired with later archaeological breaks, paired with changes in temple practice, they begin to sound like fragments of a single memory. Not necessarily a memory we can prove in the modern courtroom sense, but a civilizational memory all the same. And this is where the tone of the story should settle, not into wild certainty, but into slow, thoughtful unease. We are not standing over a solved case. We are standing over a pattern. An old list of kings. Impossible reigns. A sudden shift. Later, records of divine absence. Human rule becoming recognizably human, with all the frailty, rivalry, and shortness that implies. I have always found it slightly funny, in a dark sort of way, that when divine rule ends in these traditions, history becomes much more like what human beings are usually best at. Arguments over land, succession trouble, shorter tempers, shorter reigns, and much less cosmic dignity. Apparently, even in antiquity, once the gods stop supervising directly, the paperwork gets more stressful. But beneath that little smile is something heavier. The shrinking numbers are not only a historical curiosity, they are a psychological event. Imagine being part of a civilization that believes, or once believed, that kingship came down from heaven itself, that the earliest rulers were closer to gods than men, and that sacred authority structured the whole world. Then imagine living in the generation or the memory of the generation when that confidence faltered. The old scale of time breaks. The reigns contract. Mortality sharpens. The gods become less immediate. The world feels newly exposed. That feeling is the true beginning of our journey. Not the Anunnaki yet, in all their later speculative brightness. Not skyboats. Not underground anomalies. First, a list. A king list. Dry clay, quiet numbers, and an abrupt descent from impossible deep time into the cramped span of human years. The best dark stories often begin this way, not with a scream, but with a discrepancy. And the discrepancy spreads. The source notes that what scholars call the divine withdrawal period is not confined to the king lists. Around the same broad horizon, texts begin speaking of divine favor departing. Religious structures change. Temple architecture shifts. The old channels between heaven and earth seem to grow uncertain. So the king lists become the first tremor, the cleanest clue on the surface, the place where even a sleepy reader can feel the ground move. But they are only the beginning. Because once you notice the shrinking numbers, you start noticing everything else. The abandoned renovations, the sealed chambers, the sudden end of royal burial customs built around divine kingship, the altered sanctuaries, the priests writing in tones that sound less like myth and more like administrative grief. It is as if the whole civilization, across clay, stone, ritual, and memory, is circling one unspeakable claim. The gods used to be here in one way, and now they are not. So let the image settle. A tablet under lamplight. The wedge marks precise. The impossible names. The impossible years. Then a pause that is not visible on the clay, but can still be felt. After that, the mortal kings, nearer to us, and therefore somehow sadder. Human spans, human vulnerability, history beginning where myth recedes. The old age narrowing into our kind of time. Soon we will walk into the cities themselves and see whether mud brick and temple stone agree with the tablets. We will move through Uruk, and Eridu, where sacred architecture seems to record its own version of the same farewell. But before we leave the king lists, I want to stay one more quiet minute with that first shock, because it is the hinge on which everything else turns. The rulers become mortal because something above them has changed. Whether one calls that theological development, cultural rupture, remembered trauma, or the departure of divine beings, depends on how brave or cautious one feels after midnight. The old scribes, I think, would simply say the same thing they scratched into the clay in a dozen different ways. The favor withdrew. The faces turned away. And after that, the years themselves became shorter. There is one more quiet detail worth holding before we move on. The king list does not remove the old divine age entirely. It keeps it. It preserves the impossible reigns instead of deleting them, which means the scribes wanted the break remembered. That matters. A later administration could have normalized the whole record, trimmed the absurdity, made the past more respectable. They did not. They left the giant spans in place, like fossil bones jutting out of the side of history. They wanted later eyes to feel the mismatch, to know that once, in however they understood once, the world had operated under a larger measure. And maybe that is the first real sorrow in the story. Not simply that the gods left, if they did, but that the human world kept a memory of the old scale and had to go on living without it. Imagine farming under skies that your grandfathers said had once opened. Imagine judging land disputes while copying records of kings who belonged to ages instead of years. Imagine offering bread and beer to divine statues in rooms where people still whispered that the old direct speech had gone quiet. The gap between remembrance and ordinary labor must have felt immense. I think that is why these texts still breathe a little when we read them. They are not only records, they are fragments of adjustment. Clay evidence that a civilization was learning how to be mortal in a new way. The numbers get shorter, yes, but the ache hidden behind them gets larger, and that ache leads us forward into the sanctuaries where brick, burial, and silence begin to say the same thing. The rulers become smaller. The years become human. And somewhere above the tablets, whether in heaven, memory, or fear, something vast has already started to turn away. Once the king lists have taught us how to hear the break, the cities begin to confirm it in brick and silence. This is where the story stops, being only a strange problem on clay, and becomes something you can almost walk through. Uruk, Eridu, names that were already ancient when later empires were young. places where the mud brick foundations of sacred life were rebuilt again and again for centuries, as if continuity itself could be stacked in layers and left to dry in the sun. Then, within a surprisingly narrow frame of time, that continuity starts to fail in ways that feel abrupt, deliberate, and deeply unnerving. So let the room stay dim. Let the fire keep its patient glow. Imagine your breathing steadying while we step across hot dust into the old cities of Sumer. The air smells of baked earth and reed water. Somewhere a canal moves slowly, almost soundlessly. Temple walls rise pale in the light. Workers carry baskets. Priests pass through courtyards in linen and wool. At first glance, it is a functioning sacred world, busy, ordered, repetitive in the way real civilization must be if it hopes to last. Then you begin to notice what was left unfinished. Uruk is one of the clearest places to start. Often called the first true city, it carried the weight of beginnings, of kingship, of temples, of monumental human ambition pressed into mud brick. In the Anu district, according to the source, construction patterns changed radically during the late, early dynastic period. The Great White Temple, which had dominated the sacred precinct for generations, was abandoned in the middle of renovation. That detail has always gripped me. Not after a glorious completion, not after an orderly transition. Mid-renovation. If you were standing there with me, moving carefully through the excavated layers, you might see what the archaeologists saw. Tools left in place, work interrupted, plans half embodied in brick. It is one of those quiet details that feels louder the longer you stare at it. A people who know how to finish large sacred projects do not usually stop in the middle unless something has changed above the level of ordinary inconvenience. And the phase that comes after the abandonment is no less strange. The architecture shifts. Smaller structures, different orientations, different principles. Most importantly for the source, the elaborate drainage systems that once directed libations down into underground chambers are no longer maintained in the same way. Those chambers, described as Abzu connections, had been tied to the primordial waters below, places where ritual liquid offerings move downward toward the unseen realm of the gods. Closing them is not like changing the color of a temple wall. It is like sealing a telephone line because no one expects an answer anymore. Honestly, that is one of the moments where the story becomes almost painfully intimate. Not destruction, not iconoclasm, just the quiet ending of a habit built on contact. A libation channel no longer needed. An underground chamber sealed. A ritual path severed. The source emphasizes that carbon dating places the closure of these subterranean features across multiple sites into a narrow range, which is important because it makes the process feel coordinated rather than leisurely. Whether coordinated by shared theology, by political crisis, by some larger event, or by the remembered departure of divine beings, is exactly the question hanging over the whole narrative. But the physical pattern itself is hard to ignore. Several cities begin acting as though the old traffic between divine and earthly realms has become uncertain. Then there is Ur. Ur gives us a darker kind of evidence, because it preserves not only temple life, but burial ideology. The royal cemetery, with its elaborate tombs and its grim death pits full of attendants buried alongside rulers, represents the height of divine kingship logic. A king does not go alone, because a king is not merely a person. A king stands inside a cosmic order rich enough, or terrible enough, to draw an entire retinue into the grave. And then that pattern stops. The source places the cessation around 2450 BC and describes the last of the great burials as hasty, unfinished, and notably poorer in symbolic richness than what came before. That is a chilling detail. Not because of the death itself, though of course that is dark enough, but because the confidence has drained from the custom. The last tombs show signs of the ritual losing conviction. The grave goods become less cosmic, the layout less complete, the mood less assured. It is as if a system that once believed utterly in divine kingship has begun to doubt itself while still trying to perform the old forms one final time. You know that feeling when a tradition continues for a little while after belief has begun to leave it. The gestures are still there. The language is still spoken. The candles are still lit, but something essential has quietly stepped backward. That is the atmosphere I feel at Ur. A ritual machine, still moving, but with less presence inside it. After that, subsequent burials become more recognizably human. Single occupants. Valuable goods. Yes, but lacking the old cosmic symbolism. The ruler is no longer sent into the next world like a divine center with a whole orbit of sacrificed devotion around him. He is buried more like a mortal elite. That matters because it signals not merely economic change, but metaphysical shrinkage. The king is becoming smaller. And then there is Eridu, the old city of Enki, perhaps the most poignant sight of all in the source. Eridu carries enormous emotional weight because it was revered as the first city, the sacred southern beginning, a place where continuity should have been strongest. Its main temple had been rebuilt again and again over nearly 2 millennia, each phase maintaining the same essential pattern. That kind of persistence is not casual. It means generations looked backward and said, "No, keep the old shape. The gods still know this house." Then the final phase breaks that continuity. The source notes a radical redesign of the most sacred chamber, with what appears to be an exit passage leading directly outdoors, something unprecedented in Mesopotamian temple architecture. I find that detail almost devastating in its quietness. An exit passage from the holy core, not a hidden treasury, not another side chapel, an exit. If you were standing with me in the dust of those foundations, tracing the changed line of the wall, you might feel the hair rise on your arms just a little. Architecture rarely makes theological statements more clearly than this. The god is expected to leave. Temple archives found there deepen the impression. Texts in archaic Sumerian describe rituals performed for the last time and refer to the god's journey to distant lands. One tablet inventories divine regalia removed from the sacred chamber and placed in vessels for the long journey, with wording that implies they were not expected to return. That is administrative language, which makes it more haunting, not less. Inventory after inventory, item after item, as if a palace household were packing for a permanent departure. A crown, a ceremonial vessel, a garment, a weapon, a piece of lapis inlay. Each object once part of an inhabited sacred presence, now catalogued for removal. I think the tenderness of bureaucracy is underrated in stories like this. When people cannot stop a loss, they often begin listing things, making careful notes, numbering, recording. It is one way of loving what is leaving. The source also gives us the fragmentary composition, sometimes called "When the Gods Fled." Whether one treats it as chronicle, lament, stylized memory, or later literary framing, its emotional power is undeniable. Stars falling from their appointed places, sacred fires burning with strange colors, the statue of Inanna weeping tears of lapis lazuli. Then, the great ones, departing in the night, their radiance dimming like dying embers. That is one of those lines that stays with you because it balances grandeur and exhaustion in the same breath. Even the departure of gods can sound tired. What matters even more is the text's tone. The source stresses its matter-of-fact quality, and that is precisely why it works. It does not sound like a poet inventing a glorious catastrophe for applause. It sounds more like a record kept by people who had jobs to do while the order of the world thinned around them. Which temple? Which sequence? Which objects removed? Which flames dimmed? The horror, if we can call it horror, arrives wrapped in procedural calm. And this pattern stretches across cities. Enlil from Nippur, Enki from Eridu, Inanna from Uruk. Each departure accompanied by silenced oracle chambers and failing eternal flames. That repetition across sites is what gives the whole tradition such a strange coherence. One can argue over interpretation. One should. But it is hard not to feel that a single civilizational memory is trying to speak through all these separate remains. I sometimes think of it like walking through a house after someone has moved out carefully rather than leaving in anger. The furniture is gone. Closets are empty. Certain marks remain on the wall where things once hung. A bowl has been forgotten on a shelf. The rooms are clean enough, but not alive. There is no violence in the scene, yet it is still devastating because presence has been replaced by arrangement. That is how these temple sites feel in the source. Carefully closed, systematically altered, not ravaged so much as vacated. The later Akkadian and Babylonian material complicates the picture. Of course, it adds departure protocols, skyboats, chosen humans taken along, and cyclical interpretations meant perhaps to soften the unbearable finality of the earlier Sumerian tone. That is exactly what later cultures do with inherited losses. They explain them. They frame them. They promise recurrence where the first witnesses only felt severance. The old Sumerian atmosphere, though, remains sharper, less reconciled. More like people standing in once holy rooms and realizing the ordinary world has suddenly become much more ordinary than it used to be. And the archaeology keeps nudging in the same direction. Storage rooms emptied, not looted. Sacred areas sealed, not smashed. Building programs halted. Ritual infrastructure abandoned. The changes are too specific to feel like mere drift. Something happened, or at least something was believed to have happened strongly enough that cities reshaped their most sacred architecture around the idea of absence. If you were standing here with me, brushing fine dust from a threshold stone at Eridu, or peering down into a sealed channel at Uruk, or looking at the last great burials at with their hurried incompletion, I think you would feel the same odd combination I do. Calm on the surface, a kind of archaeological hush. Then underneath it, the pressure of a question that never quite stops asking itself. What makes a whole sacred world behave as if the line to heaven has gone dead? Soon we will move deeper into the texts that try to answer that, into fleeing gods, omas, silent chambers, and rituals performed for the last time. But before we do, I want to stay one more minute with the cities themselves. Uruk, with its abandoned renovation. Ur, with its shrinking funerary confidence. Eridu, with its exit passage from the holy chamber and its carefully packed regalia. Brick by brick, chamber by chamber, the old divine order appears to be folding itself up. No thunderbolt falls in these scenes. No final battle is carved triumphantly on a wall. The change is quieter than that. Workers stop. Channels are sealed. Tombs simplify. Sanctuaries are redesigned. The divine rooms begin to look like places someone is preparing to leave. And perhaps that is why they are so eerie. Human beings know how to narrate destruction. We are less prepared for departure. Destruction gives you rubble and blame. Departure leaves behind emptied systems and the soft administrative sorrow of things done for the last time. These Sumerian cities, at least in the way the source presents them, seem to remember that second kind of ending. Not the city smashed, but the god gone. Not the temple burned, but the temple no longer needed in the old way. The cities are still standing. The bricks are still warm from the sun, but the center is beginning to hollow out. And once you notice that, the next step in the story almost announces itself. If the temples changed this deliberately, then somewhere, someone must have written down why. There is one more image I want to leave hanging in the air before we move on. A worker's tool left where it fell during the White Temple renovation. Not lost in panic, not buried in collapse, just left. A small human object holding the shape of interruption. I think that tool may be one of the saddest witnesses in the whole story. It tells you there was still work to do. It tells you people expected continuation. And then something happened that made continuation feel pointless, or impossible, or suddenly secondary to a more urgent kind of farewell. Hey there, let us keep moving. Because once the cities themselves begin to look as though someone important is packing to leave, the tablets start saying so, in words that are somehow even colder. Not loud words. Not theatrical ones. Administrative words. Ritual words. Inventory words. The sort of words human beings use when they are trying to stay orderly in the middle of something they do not fully understand. If you have ever opened an old drawer after someone is gone and found labels, folded cloth, careful lists, and little practical arrangements that made sudden loss feel more real rather than less, then you already know the mood of these texts. That is the mood we are stepping into now. Not myth in its wildest form. Not yet. Something narrower, steadier, more unnerving. The record of departure. The source gives a fragmentary composition often called When the Gods Fled, and even the title has that strange balance of grandeur and practicality. Not when the gods conquered, or when the gods thundered, or when the gods unveiled their final secret. When the gods fled, it sounds almost like the heading on a report filed after a difficult night. What makes the text so effective is its tone. It does not sing like a triumphal hymn. It does not roar like an apocalyptic vision. It notices. It records. It tells you which omens came first, which temples were affected, which divine beings left in what order, which sacred objects were removed, which fires dimmed, which chambers fell quiet. The more matter-of-fact the language becomes, the more unsettling it feels, because panic would at least sound human. Calm procedure in the face of divine absence feels like something else. Picture a temple archive room. Clay shelves, reed baskets, dust gathering where feet do not often pass. A tablet freshly inscribed and still slightly damp in the cooler air of the chamber. A scribe pressing signs into clay while outside. Somewhere in the precinct, rituals continue under a sky that no longer feels entirely trustworthy. He is not writing poetry. Not exactly. He is preserving sequence. Omens first, then the changes in the fire, then the movements of statues and regalia, then the order of departures. It is the work of someone trying very hard not to let the event dissolve into rumor. The source says the narrative begins with omens, stars falling from their appointed places, sacred fires burning with strange colors, and the statue of Inanna weeping tears of lapis lazuli. That last image is unforgettable, not because it is loud, but because it is so specific. Blue tears, stone tears, beauty turning into grief in a form no human body would produce. If you were standing there with me in one of those temple courts, lantern light moving softly along carved surfaces, you might not know what to fear first. The altered fire, the silence, the impossible tears on a divine face, or the stillness of the priests, who would probably understand before anyone else that once temple signs behave this way, nothing ordinary is left untouched. Then the great ones depart in the night. Night is the right setting for this story. Departure always sounds heavier after dark. Sand cools. The air thins. Footsteps carry farther. A lamp inside a sanctuary begins to look very small. The source tells the sequence clearly. Enlil first from Nippur, then Enki from Eridu, then Inanna from Uruk. Each departure follows a similar pattern. The eternal flames dim. The oracle chambers fall silent. Personal effects are removed. Presence does not collapse in chaos. It withdraws. Honestly, that may be the darkest part of all. If the temples had been burned by enemies, the story would feel easier to classify. Anger, war, desecration. But this is calmer. The gods are not driven out in the text. They leave. And the people left behind are forced into the strange human task of managing a farewell larger than themselves. The source notes that Akkadian traditions preserve parallel accounts and add even more logistical detail. That is where the departure begins to look less like a poetic memory and more like a coordinated operation. There are protocols, procedures, instructions for divine withdrawal. We hear of skyboats, selected humans, designated routes, and the movement of sacred equipment. Some scholars would argue that these are later mythological expansions layered onto an older memory, and that is possible. It is wise to say so, but even as later additions, they tell us something important about how Mesopotamian minds imagined the event. Not as random loss, as organized departure. I have always found that deeply revealing. Human beings can endure catastrophe more easily than ambiguity. So if the gods seem to have gone, later tradition would naturally ask, did they go aimlessly or according to plan? The Akkadian answer leans heavily toward plan. Imagine Enki at Eridu, not as a statue only, but as a presence understood to be preparing for travel. The sacred chamber is opened. Regalia removed from hooks, shelves, chests, or hidden niches. Vessels brought out. Cloth wrapped around objects no human hands usually touched except in prescribed ritual ways. Priests moving carefully, because even in departure there are rules. One tablet from the source inventories divine regalia, taken from the sacred chamber and placed in vessels for the long journey, adding wording that suggests these items were never expected to return to their former places. Never to return. Few phrases sound colder in temple language than that. You know that feeling when a room looks the same at first glance, but something essential has already gone missing. A picture taken off the wall. A familiar coat gone from its peg. A chair slightly moved. That is the atmosphere here, except magnified into sacred life. The sanctuary still stands, but the god is already becoming a traveler. The source also says that certain humans were selected to accompany the departing divine beings. Priests and craftsmen elevated to serve in distant realms, never to return to their earthly homes. Some readers will hear that as mythic elaboration. Others will hear an old memory of elite retainers departing with cult objects or with migrating priestly groups. The story itself, though, wants us to feel the ache of chosen absence. Imagine being a potter or a ritual metalworker whose hands had long served a temple, then finding your name on a list that means you will go where others cannot. No return. No family meal afterward. No old age by the same canal. Just departure. And what of those left behind? That is the question I cannot stop thinking about. Because while later traditions love the image of skyboats and celestial destinations, the emotional core remains on the ground. Someone had to close the doors after the regalia left. Someone had to record what was taken. Someone had to tend the last flames and know they were the last. Someone had to explain to a city why the rituals that had held heaven and earth together for generations were now being performed for the final time. That is why the source keeps returning to matter-of-fact details. They are the human handprints on a metaphysical crisis. The eternal flames dimming. The silence in the oracle chambers. The removal of personal effects. The inventory of sacred weapons and ceremonial objects. The closing of shrines. The packing of vessels. The order of departure. It is all so practical that it becomes almost unbearable. At Nippur, when Enlil departs, first in the source sequence, we are meant to feel that the center of order itself is loosening. Nippur was not just another city. It was the seat of Enlil, the authority around which much of the sacred and political world oriented itself. If you were standing there with me before dawn, in the coolness that lingers just before sunrise, you might hear priests moving more quietly than usual. Hear the scrape of a vessel being lifted. Hear cloth drawn over something sacred. Then perhaps the silence. The kind of silence that seems to arrive not because sound has ended, but because response has ended. Then Eridu, old Eridu, where Enki, Lord of the Deep and of First Wisdom, follows. I find Eridu the saddest of the departures. Maybe because it feels like losing a beginning. The god of primordial waters leaving the city that had long claimed to be first. The sacred chamber altered. Regalia packed. The old relationship between temple and deep world closed down like a well sealed with a final stone. Then Inanna from Uruk. And that departure feels different again. Inanna is not a quiet deity in later memory. She burns. She descends. She demands. So the image of her statue weeping lapis tears before departure has an almost personal tenderness to it, as if even the most vivid divine presence in the urban world cannot remain embodied in its old house. I think that is why these texts matter more than simple plot. They give each departure a local grief, not only the loss of gods in general, but this god from this city, this chamber, this cult, this set of rituals, this body of people who had built their ordinary days around presence. The source later mentions Babylonian reinterpretations that present the departure as part of a larger cosmic cycle, suggesting the gods periodically withdrew to attend celestial duties. That softens the earlier finality. Understandably, cultures often revise old wounds into patterns they can survive. If the gods leave but always return in some distant rhythm, then silence becomes bearable. If the gods left once and for all, then the world after them is a lonelier place. The earlier Sumerian tone, at least as the source presents it, feels much lonelier. And perhaps that is why the later reinterpretation was needed. A world in which the gods have not been defeated, only withdrawn, can still keep temple routines going in modified form. It can maintain piety. It can hope. It can explain why rituals now feel different without admitting complete abandonment. I do not say that cynically. It is simply how human societies preserve continuity after a break too great to stare at directly. They put a cycle around it. They place the silence inside a theory. Still, beneath those later theories, the earlier dread remains. The gods fled. The fires dimmed. The chambers emptied. The city temples that once served as direct residences now begin to look like houses after the family has moved on. If you were to walk slowly through those sanctuaries with me after the final rites, the details would be almost painfully ordinary. Impressions in the dust where a vessel once sat. Hooks left bare. A floor mark where a statue base had borne weight for generations. A room acoustically unchanged, yet emotionally hollow. Human beings are good at sensing absence in places built for presence. We feel it in churches, palaces, bedrooms, schoolhouses, and apparently temples too. What the source gives us here is not just narrative, but procedure under sorrow. That is why it works so well for a sleep story of ancient collapse. The world does not end with a crash. It ends in one register by being carefully closed down. Item by item, flame by flame, room by room. The priests do not become hysterical. They become very exact, which may be the saddest thing they could do. Soon we will lift our eyes from the archive rooms and sanctuaries toward the heavens, because the source insists the sky itself participated in this transition. The stars moved strangely. Meteors rained. The heaven roads opened. Temple astronomers wrote until they no longer wrote at all. But before we do, let the last image here remain very simple. A priest with a tablet. A list of things removed. A sacred chamber behind him, already emptier than yesterday. He presses the final wedge signs into the clay while somewhere outside the city still sleeps, unaware that by morning the world may look the same and yet no longer be held by the same nearness. The gods, or whatever the old texts believed the gods to be, have begun to travel. And the human task now is to remember the order in which the lights went out. Once the temples have begun to empty, and the tablets have started speaking in the language of departure, the story raises its eyes to the sky. This is one of the points where the source becomes especially strange, and strangely compelling, because it insists that the gods did not leave in private. The heavens themselves, according to these records, announced the withdrawal first. The stars shifted. Strange lights crossed the dark. The roads of heaven were disturbed. The watchers climbed their platforms, took their measurements, pressed their signs into wet clay, and little by little began to understand that whatever was changing below was also happening above. I have always loved that ancient cities put their astronomers on top of temples. It feels exactly right. Watch the gods by getting closer to the sky, even if only by a few stories of mud brick and stone. Imagine the night air at one of those high platforms, cool after the heat of day, bronze instruments catching faint starlight. A priest astronomer wrapped in wool, eyes narrowed against the dark, patient in the old disciplined way of those who know that meaning often appears slowly. Beneath him, the city lies quiet. A dog barks once and then stops. Somewhere water moves in a canal. Above him, the heavens should be orderly. Then they are not. The source script leans on the astronomical diaries, those careful technical records that Mesopotamian temple scholars kept with astonishing seriousness. That matters, because these are not presented as ecstatic visions or temple hymns. They are observational records. Dates, positions, patterns, deviations. And in the crucial period before the final temple closures, the language begins to change. The diaries speak of stars that walked from their places and the heaven road disturbed. That phrase alone is enough to keep a person awake if read too late at night. The road of heaven disturbed. It suggests not merely spectacle, but traffic interrupted, direction altered, an order usually trusted now showing strain. The source gives us a particularly vivid example in the form of a fire star that moves against the wind of heaven. Modern readers may hear meteor, asteroid, bright comet fragment, or something of that sort. Ancient observers, of course, heard omen. If you were standing with me on one of those observation platforms while such an object crossed the night, you would not need a theory to feel its force. The sky itself would seem to have grown a wound. A bright thing moving where no bright thing should move, over day after day, pulling attention and anxiety after it like a trail. The source says this object appeared in the constellation of the Bull of Heaven and drifted toward the Eagle over 27 days. That specific kind of duration matters because it gives the whole episode a slow dread. Not a flash and gone marvel. A sustained disturbance. Something watched every night. Something measured, discussed, perhaps argued over by priests and scribes who still hoped, for a while, that a difficult pattern might settle back into normality if observed carefully enough. But it did not settle. Instead, according to the same accounts, other changes appeared around it. Bright stars varied strangely. Their light pulsed or flickered in ways that the watchers did not expect. The source suggests atmospheric scintillation or debris in the upper atmosphere as one modern possibility, and that is fair enough as a cautious note. Yet one does not need to decide the mechanism to feel the old fear. The fixed points in the sky, the things that orient farmers, priests, and kings alike, are behaving badly. And then there are the colored veils, aurora-like lights dancing in northern skies at latitudes where such lights should have been rare, or at least rare enough to be startling. Imagine that. A Mesopotamian astronomer, accustomed to the hard clarity of stars and the known rhythm of planets, suddenly seeing curtains of strange color ripple where darkness should simply remain darkness. Red, green, pale shifting sheets of light. If that is what they were, no wonder the source says these events were interpreted as cosmic confirmation that the old order was changing. When the sky begins improvising, priestly nerves do not remain steady for long. The source next moves into a specific planetary configuration. Mars in conjunction with Saturn, while Jupiter stood opposed, aligned during the heliacal rising of Sirius. It is the kind of detail that would make a temple astronomer both thrilled and deeply unhappy. Thrilled because rare configurations are what careful skywatchers live for. Unhappy because rare configurations, in a sacred world, are never only about beauty. They mean something. And in the source, they mean the gods gathering for counsel in distant places. That phrase is quietly devastating. The gods gathering, but not here. You know that feeling when people in authority start having important meetings that you are not invited to, and every hallway suddenly feels colder. It is like that, stretched across the cosmos. The divine council is assembling elsewhere. The implication is not just that heaven is active, but that earthly temples are no longer the center of that activity. The same tablet tradition in the source describes meteor showers, arrows of light falling from the region of the plow for 7 nights. Again, the atmosphere matters. Shepherds out beyond the city walls seeing streak after streak of burning motion overhead. City dwellers climbing roofs to watch. Priests trying to record number after number until counting gives way to awe or worry. The heavens are not sending one sign. They are sending too many. I think that is why the source feels effective even where it becomes more speculative. It stacks phenomena until the emotional logic is undeniable. First, the disturbed stars. Then the fire star. Then the veils. Then the planetary council. Then the meteor rain. Then brightness changes in Regulus, the king's star, pulsing over 40 days in a way no ordinary observer could easily ignore. By the time you get to the end of that sequence, even a skeptical reader begins to understand. why ancient people might have believed the sky roads were opening for something larger than weather. And the priests did more than stare. They changed things on the ground. One of the most fascinating details in the source is the reorientation of temple architecture in response to these signs. At Nippur, the primary altar is said to have been rotated 23 degrees eastward in a single construction campaign. Not gradually, not as part of some leisurely drift in ritual fashion. A decisive turn. The source argues this new angle faced the heliacal rising point of the cluster, identified as the gathering place of the divine assembly, what we would call the Pleiades. That is a wonderfully eerie image. Temple architecture literally turning its face to where the gods were thought to be going. If you were standing there with me while the old altar was dismantled and the new orientation marked out with cords and stakes, you might feel the seriousness of the act in your body. This is not decoration. It is readdressing the sanctuary. It is the spatial equivalent of changing where one sends letters because the old residence is no longer occupied. At according to the source, a new astronomical platform was built on the ziggurat to track these changes more carefully. I love that detail because it reveals a very human response to cosmic uncertainty. Watch harder. Measure more precisely. Build a better vantage point. If the gods are withdrawing, maybe observation can preserve a line of connection. Maybe if the priests learn the new paths of heaven, the city below will not be entirely abandoned. Then comes one of the most cinematic pieces in the source, the countdown calendar from the tablet that tracks celestial events one after another until a final entry that simply says, "The heaven road opens. The great ones depart. The watchers see no more." That line has the weight of a door closing in another room. The watchers see no more. Not because there is nothing to see, perhaps, but because their role itself has ended. The systematic record-keeping, the old chain of watching and interpretation, breaks there. That may be one of the saddest moments in the whole story. A civilization of careful observers reaching the point where even observation no longer holds the world together. The last entry is made. The clay dries. No next tablet follows in the old sequence. A long practiced sacred discipline stops mid-breath. The source also says many astronomer priests simply vanish from the record in this period. Some readers will take that literally. Others will suspect social upheaval, migration, or changing bureaucratic priorities. That debate is real and worth respecting. But again, the emotional pattern is the point for our narrative. The people whose entire vocation was to read the dialogue between sky and temple are either dismissed, transformed, or gone. The heavens continue, but the old conversation has changed language. One of the details I keep circling back to is the phrase "Night of the Empty Throne" from the ritual archive. It sounds ceremonial, yes, but also very intimate. An empty throne is a room-level image, a chair without its sitter, a raised place, no longer radiating authority. The source says 7 high priests stood vigil through the night while reciting incantations, and during the final performance, lights ascended from the temple roof toward the star path. Whether one hears that as ritual vision, atmospheric phenomenon, or remembered mystery, the image is unforgettable. Lights rising from the temple roof into the dark, while men below keep chanting because the alternative is to stand there with their mouths open. honestly, that feels wonderfully human. The cosmos may be coming apart overhead, but someone still has the schedule for the vigil and intends to keep it. The source briefly broadens beyond Mesopotamia, too, noting Egyptian and Chinese records of unusual celestial events around similar horizons. That claim moves into a more comparative and debated space, and it is right to treat it carefully. But as part of the story mood, it helps widen the sky. Not just one priesthood under one horizon, but many old watchers in distant lands, all noticing that familiar lights have become strange. I think the genius of this section lies in how it ties cosmic disturbance to earthly reorientation. The sky signs are not isolated wonders. They provoke altered altars, new platforms, emergency rites, revised calendars, and ultimately the cessation of observational traditions that had once been central to maintaining order. The heavens do not simply entertain, they disrupt administration, architecture, theology, and confidence. And that confidence matters. Imagine a temple astronomer whose entire training taught that the sky was a readable order, a script written by divine intention and decoded through careful watching. Then imagine that the script begins stuttering. The stars walk. The roads open. The king's star pulses. Meteors fall for 7 nights. The altar must be turned. The final entry approaches. It would not feel like science in danger. It would feel like relationship in danger. That is perhaps the key phrase for this whole section. Relationship in danger. The sky was not merely scenery for Mesopotamian religion. It was correspondence, timing, confirmation. The upper register of the same order, enacted below in temple ritual. So when the heavens became unstable, or seemed to, the meaning was not abstract. The connection itself was fraying. Soon we will come back down from the observation platforms into the temples again, because the source next insists that the closure of sacred spaces was systematic, formal, and almost painfully orderly. Bowls were left mid-ritual. Fires were extinguished. Sanctuaries sealed. Statues removed with care. But before we descend, I want to stay one last moment under this troubled sky. Picture it. Cold air on the temple roof. The scribe's fingers stiff from night work, waxing and waning torchlight behind him. Above, a heaven that should be familiar and is not. A star flares oddly. Another dims. A trail of fire crosses the dark and leaves everyone still. Somewhere below, in the chambers under the temple, priests are already preparing farewell rites. And here above them, the watchers make one more note in the clay, because that is what human beings do when something too large is happening. We write it down, hoping the record will hold what the mind cannot. The heaven road opens. The great ones depart. And after that, even the most disciplined eyes in the oldest cities begin to understand that watching alone will not bring them back. Once the sky has begun to misbehave, the temples below cannot remain unchanged for long. That is one of the quiet mercies of the story, if mercy is the word. The priests are not left to wonder forever whether the disturbed stars mean anything. The answer arrives in stone rooms, in offering bowls, in channels clogged with sacred oils, in fires that had burned for generations and then were deliberately put out by the very hands that once protected them. The heavens say something is ending, and the sanctuaries answer, yes, we know. So let the night deepen around us a little more. Let the candle beside us hold its narrow gold line. Imagine now that we are walking not on a temple roof under the cold stars, but back down through stairways of mud brick and worn stone, into chambers where the air is warmer, heavier, and faintly fragrant with old incense. The city outside is still there. Yes, donkeys in the lanes, water in the canals, a dog nosing through reeds, human life continuing in its stubborn, ordinary way. But in the inner rooms of the sacred precinct, everything has changed. The source says the great temple complexes do not show the sort of decline we usually expect from political disorder or economic exhaustion. They do not look abandoned by degrees. They look interrupted, frozen mid-gesture. That distinction matters. A slow decline has a different emotional texture. It leaves behind patchwork repairs, cheap substitutions, long fatigue. This is more immediate than that. A ceremony underway, then halted. A flame still burning, then closed according to rule. A bowl still full, then left where it stood. Uruk gives us some of the clearest examples. In the inner sanctum of the Anu complex, archaeologists found offering bowls that still held dried food remains, as if the ritual that had once animated them had stopped before anyone thought to clear the space. I have always found such evidence more moving than monumental ruin. A toppled wall is dramatic. A dish left untouched feels intimate. Someone placed it there with care, expecting sequence, prayer, response, the usual holy rhythm. Then that rhythm failed, or was no longer needed, or was broken by something larger than routine, and the bowl stayed. If you were standing there with me in that chamber, the first thing you might notice would be the stillness. Not the noble silence of a functioning sanctuary before dawn, but the heavier kind, the kind rooms take on after purpose has left. Dust settling on stone, a smell of dried grain, oil, old clay, and something faintly sweet from residues that once mattered very much. A place that was not meant to be quiet this way. The libation channels tell the story even more sharply. These were the carefully engineered stone conduits designed to carry sacred liquids down toward underground chambers, linking the altar zone to the deeper cosmic realm. In the source they are found clogged with a mixture of precious oils, wine, and frankincense resin in quantities far beyond normal daily use. Farewell offerings. The tablets call them gifts for the journey. Again, the language is terribly calm. Not emergency dumping. Not desecration. Farewell. You know that feeling when you realize a room has been arranged not for everyday living, but for last use. A final meal set out. A letter left on a table. Candles burning lower than usual because no one plans to relight them. That is the mood of these clogged channels. They were not merely neglected. They were filled as part of closure, as if the road downward itself had to be honored one last time before being allowed to fail. At Nippur, the evidence grows stranger still. The source describes a final ritual meal laid out in the main altar chamber. Multiple courses prepared, expensive foods brought in, golden serving plates positioned, and then the whole thing left unfinished. Roasted peacock, honey-glazed dates, rich foods of celebration or solemn feast. Yet several dishes remained untouched, personal items of the diners, seals, ceremonial daggers, drinking vessels, were left scattered across the room as though the participants rose suddenly and did not come back. Honestly, that detail bothers me in exactly the right way. It feels too domestic for myth and too ceremonial for accident. You can picture it too easily. People seated in order, the low talk of attendants, the warm smell of meat and honey, the clink of metal on vessel rims. Then an interruption. Not panic, perhaps, not shouted alarm, but some signal strong enough that people stood, left their own things behind, and followed a new urgency into the next room, or out into the court, or into the night. Beneath the altar at Nippur, the source places one of its most evocative finds, a sealed chamber containing silver tablets that describe rites of severance and final communion. Whether every detail of that archive is as certain as the narrative wants it to be is open to discussion, and it is good to admit that, but as a storytelling spine it is powerful. The hidden archive of instructions not for summoning, not for enthronement, not for the abundance of divine presence, but for ending the connection properly. That is a very different kind of religion. The rites of severance in the source are elaborate. They outline how sacred objects are to be transferred, how precincts are to be closed, how the cords between heaven and earth are to be cut in sequence. I think the word sequence matters there. Human beings become calmer when they can number the steps of a loss. First, this fire, then this chamber, then this stone, then this invocation. Order becomes a kind of mercy when nothing else does. And then there are the eternal flames. This may be the most haunting thread in the entire section. For centuries, according to the source, some temple fires were never allowed to die. They were tended by hereditary priests whose entire family lines were braided into that task. Imagine such a life. Grandfather, father, son, each one learning the same gestures, the same timings, the same care with ash and fuel and sacred continuity. The flame outlasting names, rains, disputes, repairs, harvests. A line of fire running through generations, like a living signature of divine residence. And then, in this narrow period, those fires are deliberately extinguished, not by invaders, not by neglect, by ritual closure. At Eridu, the source says the sacred flame was ceremonially transferred into portable braziers. The main altar was dismantled with care, its stones removed, and the underlying chamber filled with sand brought from a distant shore. That is one of those details that only becomes sadder the longer you think about it. Someone carried sand for this purpose. Someone knew which kind of sand was required. Someone believed closure had its own correct materials, just as opening once had. If you were standing here with me while the final fire was being handled, you might hear very little. A small hiss of ember, bronze touching stone, the dry whisper of sand poured into a chamber that had once belonged to flame. No grand music, just the measured work of ending. The room would smell of warm ash, resin, old heat, and finality. The source also describes the careful removal of divine statues. That matters because it distinguishes closure from looting. Statue bases show signs of controlled lifting. Wooden frames used to extract the images without damaging their ritual purity. This is not the work of enemies stripping a shrine. This is relocation. Orderly, practiced, almost tender. The god leaves with dignity. The room is then left to human silence. Temple inventories from Girsu and elsewhere list what was removed. Golden vessels, lapis inlays, ceremonial weapons, tablets of instruction, and the destinations are described in terms like the high places, the skyboat, the celestial storehouse. Whether we interpret those phrases literally, symbolically, or somewhere in the uneasy middle, the emotional point remains the same. The objects were not disappearing at random. They were going somewhere. I have always thought inventories are one of the saddest genres of human writing. They pretend objectivity, but they usually appear where people are trying not to cry. One vessel, one throne fitting, 2 lapis plaques, 3 ritual blades. The more exact the list, the more palpable the loss behind it. Then come the people. Temple personnel records, according to the source, show dismissals beginning about a year before final closures. That timing is quietly devastating. Imagine the rumors in those corridors. The senior priest not meeting your eye. The accountant unusually generous with severance. Gifts of remembrance handed to people who have spent their adult lives serving a god who now, apparently, no longer requires their daily labor. The source says these payments were substantial, which suggests planning rather than emergency. The institution knew what was coming before the rank and file fully did. Even stranger is the disappearance of certain elite temple figures. High priests, sacred musicians, specialist craftsmen attached to the innermost cult functions. They are not listed as dismissed. They simply vanish from the records. No transfer, no retirement, no burial notice. Just absence where once there had been regular administrative presence. Some readers will hear that and move immediately toward the extraordinary. Others will think of archival gaps, elite displacement, migration, or political trauma. Both responses are understandable. But the way the source uses this detail is effective because it intensifies the mood of selective removal. Not everyone is left behind. Some go. The source then describes letters from Lagash and other archives where priests complain that divination has begun to fail. The divine voice no longer speaks through the sacred lots. Dreams bring darkness and confusion. The old methods still exist physically, but their results have turned unreliable. I think anyone who has ever watched a familiar system stop working understands the dread of that. Not dramatic destruction, just failure where there used to be response. Turn the key, and nothing happens. Ask the question, and the chamber gives back only your own breathing. And so councils are formed, procedures invented. Human authority begins improvising itself where divine response once stood. This transition will matter even more later, when we reach the larger political changes of the post-departure age. But already here in the temples you can feel the beginning of it. Humans creating substitutes, voting procedures, interpretive committees, modified rituals, more writing where there had once been presence. Still, before any adaptation can settle in, the old world has to be closed. The source describes ceremonies for sealing the gates between worlds, underground chambers filled with consecrated sand, stone thresholds mortared shut, acoustic systems dismantled, bronze focusing devices removed, architectural elements specifically associated with divine communication taken out of service one by one. It is an image of systematic severance, almost like shutting down a network. If you were walking with me through those precincts at the end, perhaps carrying a lamp shielded with your hand against the draft, you would notice how much the story depends on small actions. A stone lifted, a doorway sealed, a brazier carried, a list copied, a vessel wrapped, a flame pinched out. None of these things looks world-ending on its own, but together they form the shape of a civilization, accepting that the line between human and divine has gone dark. That is why I think this part of the story is so affecting. It refuses easy melodrama. The temples are not mostly smashed. They are closed. The gods are not mostly slain. They are absent. The priests are not all hysterical. They are exhausted, procedural, bewildered, and precise. It feels real in the way administrative sorrow often does. Soon we will move deeper into the first-person witness accounts. Priests entering sanctuaries before dawn. Statues turned in strange directions. Sacred water behaving impossibly. Voices from stone giving closure instructions. And all the psychic unraveling that followed. But before we leave the temples themselves, I want to stay one moment longer by the last fires. Picture those braziers again. Portable, glowing, low. The old eternal flame now reduced to something carried in human hands. A line of priests moving through dark passages with the last embers of an age. There is almost a heartbreaking humility in that image. For centuries, the gods had been given houses of brick, precious metals, carved thresholds, permanent hearths. In the end, what remains is a handful of carried fire and the knowledge that by dawn the sanctum will no longer be what it was. The bowls dry out. The channels clog. The altars cool. The statues are gone. The staff are paid and dismissed. The doors are sealed. And outside, unbelievably, the city keeps breathing. That may be the final cruelty of sacred endings. The canal still moves. The reeds still whisper. The market opens. Bread is baked. Children laugh somewhere in a side street. Yet inside the temple complex, the ancient agreement has been closed with care, so formal it feels almost tender. The world has not ended. Only its center has moved somewhere beyond the reach of those who remain. There is one small detail from this whole section I cannot quite stop thinking about. The gifts of remembrance given to dismissed temple workers. It is such a human thing to do. Someone knew that wages were not enough. Something had to be placed in the hand. A token, a payment, a final acknowledgement that years had been spent in the service of something that was now withdrawing. Those gifts feel like the last warm objects in the whole story. After them comes colder material, witness accounts, altered flames, strange water, and the direct speech of departing powers. And that is where we go next, into the chambers, where the priests themselves say they saw the final moments unfold. By the time we reach the priestly testimonies, the story becomes harder to hold at a safe distance. Archaeology can be cool, even when it is eerie. Burn marks, sealed rooms, inventory tablets. These are tangible and therefore strangely manageable. But first-person witness accounts are different. They ask us to stand where someone stood, to feel the room as he felt it, to sense the exact moment when a familiar ritual stopped behaving like ritual and began behaving like revelation, or delusion, or trauma, or all three at once. The source says the most detailed account comes from a damaged tablet at Nippur, written by a priest called Ernanshi, high priest of the third rank. Whether every part of that reconstruction is accepted by every scholar is another matter, and it is only fair to say so. Some of this material lives in a zone of interpretation and controversy. Still, as a narrative core, it is powerful, because it gives us not a king, not a later Put, but a temple servant describing what he says happened on what he calls the night of the Great Silence. I think that phrase deserves a slow breath around it. The night of the Great Silence, not the night of the battle, not the night of the storm. Silence. The thing that terrifies priests most is not attack, but the absence of response. Picture him entering the inner sanctum before dawn. He has done this for 20 years, the source says, which means his body would know the movements before thought fully woke. The turn of the corridor, the coolness of the stone, the smell of old incense and oil, the small, careful preparation of sacred water, the order of gestures handed down from men older than his father. Habit is one of the strongest forms of confidence human beings possess, and Anunnaki, stepping toward the chamber that morning, would have been walking on habit. Then the room is wrong. The eternal flame that should have burned in its usual color flickers with a blue-white radiance. That detail has a very particular chill to it. Not extinguished, altered. The light casts shadows that seem to move incorrectly, as if they have become independent of the things making them. The statue of Enlil, which should face east toward the coming sun, has somehow turned north, toward the direction associated with the underworld. Imagine seeing that after 20 years of repetition, a god who has always looked one way now looking another. The fixed thing, unfixed. You know that feeling when you wake in the night and a familiar room is almost, but not quite, itself. A chair where it should not be. A door ajar. Light under a frame that is usually dark. That little dislocation before fear chooses its shape. The sanctum in Ernanki's testimony feels like that. Only sacred, is formal, and far harder to dismiss as imagination. The source then gives us one of the strangest images in the whole body of evidence. The sacred water does not pour normally. Instead, it forms spherical droplets that hover briefly in the air before falling in patterns resembling cuneiform signs. I admit, That is the kind of detail that sounds impossible and therefore immediately memorable. Some readers will feel it tips the account into visionary territory. Others will hear in it the voice of a witness, reaching for language equal to an event he did not know how to explain. Either way, as storytelling, it is extraordinary. The rite itself is refusing its old rules. Even water, the most obedient element in ordinary temple action, has become unreadably alive. Ernanchi says he recognized some of the water-formed signs as phrases in an archaic dialect older than his own everyday ritual speech. That is psychologically convincing in a curious way. When people encounter events they experience as sacred rupture, they often reach first for the oldest language they know. Age gives authority when the present no longer feels stable. Then he approaches the statue. Mesopotamian temple statues were not merely reminders. They were treated as inhabited centers of presence. Fed, washed, clothed, approached with the etiquette one uses for a living ruler. The source insists on that, and rightly so, because without it, the next detail loses much of its force. As Ernanchi nears Enlil for the morning ablution, he sees the inlaid eyes of the statue, weeping what later interpreters call liquid gold. That image is almost too strong to paraphrase. Gold is the metal of permanence, of offering, of sacred prestige. Tears are the sign of grief, loss, surrender, or unbearable pressure. Join the two, and you get a god mourning in the very substance human beings most associated with divine wealth. If you were standing there with me, holding a lamp low and trying to decide whether your hands were shaking from fear or from the cold, I doubt you would ever forget the sight. Then the voice comes. According to the account, the statue speaks, not with a moving mouth in the childish sense, but with a voice emanating from the stone itself. Again, this is the moment where modern readers split. Some will think liturgical dramatization. Some will think visionary trance. Some will think there may once have been ritual technologies or acoustic effects behind such experiences. Others will simply hear the old claim plainly. The god spoke. For the purposes of the story, the important thing is not forcing certainty. It is preserving the witness atmosphere. Ernanchi believed he received direct instructions, and those instructions were not about blessing, victory, or abundance. They were about closure. The god tells him, "The time has come for the great withdrawal." That phrase in the mouth of stone has a terrible dignity. The god does not sound panicked. The god sounds administrative. There are procedures to follow. Certain fires must be extinguished in a sequence. Foundation stones removed from specific points. Incantations performed to seal the gates between realms. Sacred objects gathered for transport to what the account calls the staging area for ascension. Even in departure, the cosmos apparently prefers order. Honestly, that is one of the eeriest consistencies in this whole source. Every layer, architecture, archives, ritual leftovers, and eyewitness testimonies insists on procedure. The gods do not simply stop taking calls. They initiate a shutdown. Parallel accounts from other cities deepen the atmosphere. A damaged testimony from by a keeper of sacred vessels named Naram in the source, describes the moon god's regalia being removed under direct divine instruction. Naram notes that the beings overseeing the process looked human in broad outline, but not entirely. Their skin seemed subtly luminous. Their eyes reflected light, like polished metal. Their forms were solid, and yet at moments appeared faintly translucent, with shadows that did not behave properly. That is exactly the kind of detail I would expect from a witness account hovering between devotion and shock. Not a full, coherent taxonomy of the supernatural, but sharp sensory fragments. Light wrong on skin, shadows wrong on floors. The body registering discrepancy faster than the mind can classify it. Naram also observes something else important. The departing beings are selective. They do not take everything valuable. They ignore certain gold pieces and ornaments. Instead, they choose ceremonial weapons, astronomical devices, and tablets written in what he calls the script of heaven. That selective pattern appears across the source again and again, and it is one reason later readers have found the material so tantalizing. It suggests purpose, not theft, not panic. Purpose. The emotional cost of these experiences on the priests is another thread the source handles well. Accounts from Lagash and elsewhere describe insomnia, recurring nightmares, a persistent sense of invisible observation, and the collapse of trusted divination practices. The dreams stop working. The sacred lots contradict themselves. Incubation rituals produce empty sleep or visions of abandoned landscapes and silent skies. I think anyone who has lived through the failure of a trusted pattern can feel the ache in that. These men were trained for response. Their gods had always answered in one form or another. Then suddenly the old channels return only static. The high priestess Ninala, in the source, is particularly affecting. She tries repeatedly to restore contact with the goddess Bao through increasingly elaborate rites, and nothing works. I imagine her in a chamber, faintly scented with resin and old linen, hands moving through each familiar gesture with extra precision, as though perfect performance might pull heaven back across the threshold. The lots are cast, the offerings made, the formulas recited. Still nothing but contradiction, silence, or darkness. That is a very intimate kind of grief. The grief of ritual no longer meeting the world it was built to address. From such failures emerge the councils of interpretation, human committees, replacing direct oracle speech. It almost sounds drab next to weeping statues and luminous beings, but in some ways it is the more radical moment. Once divine speech ceases, humans must learn to govern ambiguity together. They vote, they debate, they compare readings. It is the beginning of a more recognizably human religious bureaucracy, and you can feel both the ingenuity and the sorrow in it. They are not restoring contact. They are learning to live without it. The source also lingers on the sealing rites, the ceremonies that formally close the channels between worlds. Priests from multiple temples gather. Gateways are mortared shut with prepared substances. Underground chambers are filled. Listening devices and bronze sound focusing plates are removed. Incantations in archaic Sumerian are spoken, not to open, but to close. I think that reversal is one of the most powerful symbolic turns in the whole story. Ritual language that once invited dissent now performs severance. If you were standing there with me during one of those sealing ceremonies, you might notice the tension between the grandeur of the language and the human fragility of the speakers. Voices steadying themselves, lamp smoke wavering, mortar spread with careful hands along a seam that no one had ever expected to close forever. Perhaps a younger priest glancing toward an elder, hoping for one last sign that the old contact will resume before the final stone is set. But the stone is set. The formula is completed. The door holds. Comparative reading of these testimonies in the source reveals striking consistencies. Altered light, temperature shifts, acoustic anomalies, statues behaving as if inhabited, detailed closure instructions, selective removal of sacred objects, psychological disorientation among personnel. That consistency is one reason the accounts feel more than merely decorative. Independent witnesses do not tell the exact same story, but they keep circling the same cluster of sensations. Wrong light, wrong sound, wrong silence, then instruction. I have always thought that the saddest moment in such accounts is not the supernatural display itself, but the aftermath. The priest who must go back through the corridors and tell others what was said. The woman who has to dismiss temple staff while still trying to believe her own gods have not abandoned her. The young initiate who has never known the temple in any form but this fading one, and who cannot quite imagine what the older generation means when they speak of direct presence as though it were once ordinary. The source notes that many of these tablets show signs of emotional strain, spelling errors, repetitions, broken syntax. That feels right to me. Extreme events leave fingerprints in ordinary language. Even scribes lose steadiness when the frame of reality tilts. Soon we will move into the source's most controversial material, the physical anomalies, strange burn marks, unusual metallurgy, underground structures, and all the modern interpretive layers that try to read these testimonies through technology rather than theology. But before we leave the human witnesses, I want to hold one image a little longer. Urnanshi in the sanctum, blue-white flame, water rising into hovering droplets, golden tears in stone eyes, a voice emerging from the statue not to bless him, but to tell him exactly how to shut the house of a god. That is the kind of scene a civilization does not forget, even when it later argues about what it meant. And perhaps that is the true center of the whole story. Not whether every account can be proven in the modern academic sense, though that question matters. Not whether the gods were gods, or kings, or memories, or advanced beings wrapped in ancient language. The true center is the experience of those who believed themselves to be present at the ending of direct contact. They did not describe a glorious apocalypse. They described instructions, sorrow, altered light, procedural closure, and the unbearable practical work of continuing after a sacred conversation had ended. There is one last detail from these testimonies that lingers with me. The divine beings, in several accounts, do not seem angry. Distant, yes. Resolved, certainly, but not enraged. That changes the emotional shape of the whole narrative. It is not exile by punishment in the crude sense. It is withdrawal under protocol. That makes it colder, more adult, harder to bargain with. A furious god might be appeased. A departing one has already made the decision. So let the chamber dim now in your mind. Let the final instructions echo once and then soften. The priests have heard what they never wanted to hear. The rites of closure are underway. Human committees are replacing divine voices. Dreams no longer carry clear answers. And somewhere beneath the ritual language and the careful inventories, a more personal truth is settling into the bones of the witnesses. Tomorrow they will still wake, still wash, still copy tablets, still argue about procedure. But the world they wake into will no longer be the same world their teachers promised them, because the old nearness has thinned, and what comes next will belong more and more to human hands. By the time we reach the physical anomalies, the story changes texture once again. We are no longer standing only with priests in sanctuaries or scribes under lamplight. We are standing beside excavators, surveyors, metallurgists, radar technicians, and later interpreters who look at burn marks in limestone and strange alloys in ceremonial objects and ask a question that makes historians nervous for very good reason. What if some part of the Old Testimony was trying to describe technology in the only language available to it? I think it is important to move gently here. The source becomes much more speculative in this section, and some of the claims live well outside ordinary scholarly consensus. That does not mean they are useless for storytelling. It simply means the tone must stay careful. Some researchers argue, others remain unconvinced. We cannot be sure. But the source clearly wants this layer of the narrative to feel like the point where myth, archaeology, and forbidden possibility begin leaning into one another until their shadows overlap. So let the room remain quiet. Let the fire sink a little lower. Imagine now that we are no longer in a temple archive, but in an excavation trench at Nippur, Ur, or Babylon. The air is dry. Dust clings to the cuffs of trousers and to the skin around the mouth. Brushes move softly over stone. Small tools click against compacted earth. A team kneels over a block that should, by all accepted logic, look ordinary. But it does not. The source describes unusual burn patterns at sacred sites, especially at Nippur, where stone blocks appear marked by heat far beyond what normal Bronze Age fires should have produced. Not broad blackening, not ordinary damage from timber burning against masonry, but geometric channels fused into limestone, spiraling inward or cutting across the surface in ways that feel almost designed. If you were standing here with me while an investigator traced those lines with a gloved finger, you might feel the old archaeological thrill, the moment when a ruin stops being background and becomes a question. According to the source, later analysis suggested temperatures exceeding anything conventional ancient furnaces could manage. More provocative still, there was said to be little sign of normal fuel residue. No easy ash explanation. No straightforward evidence of a timber blaze or raider fire. Instead, the marks are presented as though some more focused source of energy had touched the stone. That is the point where ordinary archaeology starts rubbing its forehead and asking for a very strong drink. At Ur, the source points to vitrified sections in the royal cemetery area, surfaces turned almost glass-like, smooth in places where heat appears to have altered the material itself. Again, this is not impossible in principle. Fire can do astonishing things under the right conditions. Yet the source insists the patterns are too exact, too localized, too regular to fit the usual categories. The vitrification appears where certain texts place divine manifestations. That narrative fit may be coincidence. It may also be the sort of thing later storytellers adore because it lets stones seem to remember what language only half preserved. Then the story moves underground. This may be the most effective part of the anomaly section, because underground structures always work well in the human imagination. They suggest secrecy, preservation, the possibility that what mattered most was never left fully on the surface. The source describes magnetic irregularities and linear subsurface formations beneath temple complexes, especially at Eridu and Babylon. Some of these anomalies appear as regular paths or corridors extending in unnaturally straight lines, converging at points associated in tablets with gathering places, departure zones, or hidden, sacred infrastructure. If you were standing beside the modern survey equipment with me, looking at the ghostly lines on a screen, you might feel that familiar temptation to make patterns too quickly. Human minds are shameless that way. We see 3 straight lines and a buried chamber, and immediately begin whispering about machines, gates, or lost operations centers. Sometimes the mind is right. Often it is just being dramatic. The difficulty is that the source feeds that instinct very skillfully. It pairs the subsurface lines with old texts about routes to the high places and chambers beneath the sacred precinct. The result is hard to forget even if one stays skeptical. The metallurgy in the source is even more provocative. Ceremonial bronze and gold objects from major temple sites are said to contain rare trace elements or manufacturing tolerances beyond what modern experimental archaeology has comfortably replicated using accepted ancient methods. Now, this is exactly the sort of claim that demands caution. Experimental archaeology is a wonderful discipline, but failure to replicate something under one set of assumptions does not automatically prove alien involvement or lost super science. It may prove only that ancient craftsmen were extremely good, or that we have not fully reconstructed their tools, labor systems, or tolerances. Still, in a story like this, the details matter. The source mentions a ceremonial dagger from Ur with an edge and finish measured to astonishing precision. Imagine it resting under museum glass. Small, bright, dignified, looking almost modest until magnification turns it into an insult to your assumptions. A blade so exact it seems to belong less to a Bronze Age workshop than to a much later world of machining and controlled production. I have always thought artifacts like that are unnerving because they make history feel less linear than we were promised. Not necessarily stranger in a cosmic sense, but less obedient. Then there are the crystals. The source speaks of quartz-like formations or crystal matrices embedded in underground temple chambers, especially at Babylon, arranged in ways that suggest acoustic or piezoelectric function. Now we are firmly in the zone where some readers lean forward and others lean back. I sympathize with both. It is easy to overread such evidence, especially when ancient religion already supplies a language of power, resonance, dissent, and divine communication. Yet it is also true that ancient builders often understood acoustics and spatial effect with far greater sophistication than modern people casually assume. They knew what chanting did in a chamber. They knew how stone carried voice. They knew how resonance altered presence. So when the source links crystal structures, sound tubes, and listening chambers to divine speech, the idea may be speculative, but it is not emotionally absurd. Imagine descending into one of those lower spaces, the air cooler now, and slightly damp, your footsteps softer, the ceiling close, light from the lamp scraping along walls that have not seen the sun in thousands of years. In a niche or foundation cavity, there are patterned mineral forms, perhaps quartz, perhaps not exactly, catching light in an almost cold way. Above you, through shafts or tuned channels, ritual sound would once have entered. Below you, the chamber seems built not merely to store, but to respond. The source also raises chemical residues found in ceremonial vessels, compounds not easily matched to familiar ancient substances, including references to polymer-like materials and proteins with unusual characteristics. This is the point where most sober archaeologists would place their hands gently on the table and say, "Slow down." Quite right, too. Ancient contamination, modern contamination, degraded materials, testing errors, overinterpretation. All these possibilities must be admitted. But again, our task in this phase is to keep the source spine faithful. The source wants these residues to feel like traces of advanced or unusual material culture, leftovers from offerings or divine sustenance too complex for conventional models. I think the strongest way to carry that in story form is not by over-asserting it, but by letting the strangeness sit. A bowl scraped clean in antiquity. Millennia pass. A technician in a lab coat studies residue under modern light and finds molecular patterns that do not fit the easy categories. Nothing explodes. No triumphant soundtrack plays. Just a moment of quiet professional confusion. Those moments often do more narrative work than sensational declarations ever could. Then the source moves into human remains. This is where the story becomes especially charged, because once one starts speaking about priestly lineages, genetic irregularities, and altered bodies, the whole ancient divine withdrawal narrative begins leaning toward the paleo-contact. Reading the source clearly prefers elite burials, according to the source, show unusual cranial capacity, dense bone structure, and genetic markers more concentrated in high-ranking religious lines. It even mentions apparent surgical precision in cranial modifications and traits associated with enhanced cognition or toxin resistance. These are the sorts of claims that absolutely require trustworthiness signals in the telling. Some researchers claim this. It remains debated. We cannot verify many of these conclusions at face value, but as part of the source's internal logic, they matter enormously. They are meant to suggest that the people closest to the gods were not merely socially elevated, but physically distinct, perhaps through long-term selection, ritual practice, or something more radical. If you were standing beside one of those excavated skeletons with me, laid out in the soft, controlled light of a conservation lab, I think the feeling would be less thrill than melancholy. Bone is always humbling. Grand theories hover above it. Yes, but what lies on the table is still a human frame, or nearly human frame. Once clothed, once speaking, once breathing incense and dust in a temple corridor. Even when the source invites extraordinary conclusions, the emotional truth remains grounded. These were lives. not just evidence. At this point, the paleo-contact interpretation steps fully into view. The source connects the anomalous burn marks, advanced metallurgy, subsurface installations, unusual residues, genetic irregularities, and global patterns into a single hypothesis. The Anunnaki, or whatever older memory lies behind them, may not have been gods in the theological sense alone, but advanced extraterrestrial or non-human beings engaged in a structured intervention in early civilization. Their temples were installations as much as sanctuaries. Their rituals encoded technologies. Their departure was operational. Their promises of return were not metaphorical. Now, whether one finds that plausible, impossible, seductive, or faintly exhausting depends a great deal on temperament. I have always thought the attraction of such theories lies partly in their ability to make ancient texts feel dangerously literal again. A skyboat ceases to be a poetic image and becomes a vehicle. Divine food becomes engineered substance. Temple flame becomes power source. The old world reanimates itself in a new genre. And yet, there is a cost to that move. Reduce everything to lost machines, and one risks losing the emotional and symbolic intelligence of the ancient people themselves. Keep everything purely symbolic, and one risks flattening anomalies that may still deserve curiosity. The strongest storytelling lives in the tension between those readings. That is why I think the source works best when held with both hands at once. On one side, the serious caution of history, archaeology, contamination issues, interpretive drift, and the need to resist wishful certainty. On the other side, the persistent unease that ancient civilizations may indeed have known things, built things, or preserved experiences that no longer fit comfortably inside the neat ladder of progress we were taught. The source broadens its case by pointing to global parallels. Egypt, the Indus Valley, later American sites, strange burn patterns, impossible stonework, unusual metallurgy, and common stories of departing gods or advanced beings leaving Earth or retreating to the sky. Some of those comparisons are more persuasive than others. Some are clearly looser than the source admits. But the emotional function is unmistakable. The divine withdrawal of Mesopotamia is recast as one local expression of a planetary pattern. Not one temple system falling quiet, but a world stage on which multiple sacred centers go dim around the same great turning. You know that feeling when one odd thing can be ignored, two can be explained away, but 5 or 6 together begin to suggest a pattern even before the mind knows what to call it. That is exactly the sensation the source is trying to create. Burn marks, vitrified stone, magnetic corridors, precision metals, unusual residues, altered bones, ancient sky signs, vanishing priests, sealed gates, global myths. By the end of the list, the reader is not being asked to believe one fact. The reader is being asked to inhabit a mood of cumulative disturbance. And perhaps that is the truest thing in this whole speculative layer. Disturbance. A sense that the past may not be as domesticated as we prefer. That the old divine withdrawal narratives might preserve not one clean truth, but a knot of truths. Religious memory, political trauma, observational precision, symbolic language, and perhaps experiences that later ages no longer had the vocabulary to process, except as gods descending, gods ruling, and gods departing. Soon, in the final movement, we will leave the anomalies behind and ask what happened to human civilization after that departure, or after the memory of that departure had settled into law, kingship, warfare, and text-based authority. The gods go, and the human age begins in earnest. That is where the story becomes both sadder and more familiar. But before we move on, I want to hold one last image from this section. A researcher in a modern lab, very tired, probably under fluorescent lights no ancient priest would have tolerated, looking through a microscope at a tiny trace of residue or a polished edge of ancient metal, and feeling for one long second the same thing a temple astronomer must once have felt under the disturbed stars. The old order of explanation is not quite enough. Something is left over. Something does not fit. And whether that remainder belongs to advanced human skill, layered memory, contamination, lost technique, or the faint after-image of beings once treated as gods, it keeps the past from going fully dark. That may be why these theories endure. Not because they solve everything, but because they protect the mystery from being closed too neatly. They keep the temple doors slightly open, the underground chambers faintly resonant, the strange blade under glass still gleaming with a precision that makes you wonder if the old priests were wrong about the gods, or only wrong about what word to use. After the gods withdraw, or after human beings become convinced they have withdrawn, the world does not stop. That may be the most difficult truth in the whole story. The sky can change. The oracle can fall silent. The sanctuary can be sealed. The old flames can be carried away in braziers and reduced to ash. And still the river keeps moving. Bread is still baked. Children still grow. Fields still need measuring. Walls still need repairing. A civilization does not get the luxury of freezing in reverence forever. Someone must govern after the sacred conversation ends. This is where the story becomes less cosmic and, in its own way, more severe, because once divine kingship recedes, human kingship must learn to stand on its own legs. The source is very clear about the scale of that transformation. It is not a minor theological adjustment. It is the birth of a different age, one in which power, law, administration, warfare, and even personal identity begin moving under recognizably human pressure. Let the room remain quiet. Let the fire settle lower now. We have spent a long time in temples, archives, skywatch platforms, sealed corridors, and underground chambers. Now we step back into the open city, into the wide streets, the canal edges, the granaries, the walls, the courtrooms, the markets, the soldiers' yards. The sacred center is still physically present in many places, but it no longer radiates the same certainty. The human world begins filling that silence almost immediately. The source points first to the administrative and political vacuum left behind by temple-centered rule. For centuries, these city-states had organized themselves around institutions that did not merely claim divine blessing, but direct divine management. Temple estates controlled enormous tracts of land. Priestly hierarchies handled distribution, ritual timing, labor obligations. legal pronouncements, and cosmic legitimacy all at once. Remove direct divine presence from that structure, and one does not get a tidy handover. One gets a crisis in the grammar of authority. At Ur, according to the source, the temple of Nana had once controlled a massive share of agricultural production. When such institutions begin transferring holdings to secular or royal administration, the effect is not simply bureaucratic. It is civilizational. Think of it. Fields that once belonged to a god, or to the earthly household of a god, are now counted under human stewardship. Water rights are negotiated by men. Surplus is allocated by officials whose decisions cannot simply be clothed in the old certainty of divine instruction. That is an entirely different burden. I have always thought that the first truly human age begins not when people stop believing in gods, but when they stop expecting gods to do the paperwork. The source says new secular law codes emerge in this period, or at least that older divine models give way to legal systems grounded more explicitly in human judgment, administration, and public authority. That is a remarkable shift. Law ceases to be merely the immediate expression of divine speech and becomes a textual structure maintained by human interpretation. Once again, the writing matters. Text replaces presence. Tablets hold what voices no longer deliver directly. It is hard not to feel the sadness of that, even while admiring the ingenuity. If you were standing with me in one of those early legal courts, perhaps under a roof of timber and packed reed matting, listening to scribes read out decisions while petitioners waited in dust and heat, you might sense the change in atmosphere at once. The old temple world had vertical certainty. The divine statue spoke, or the oracle responded, or the ritual clarified. The new world has arguments, precedents, evidence, and negotiation. That is more mature, perhaps. It is certainly more political. It is also lonelier. The source also emphasizes militarization. Once divine protection is believed to have withdrawn, walls get thicker. Cities become more aggressively defended. Territorial conflicts sharpen. The old idea that the god's personal presence anchors order in the city gives way to the very human recognition that if your walls fail, your grain goes elsewhere and your children suffer for it. That realization hardens architecture. It hardens rulers too. Uruk, says the source, expands its fortifications dramatically. Across Mesopotamia, political struggles over land, water, and trade intensify. This feels almost inevitable. Remove a shared vertical order, and horizontal competition swells. Gods once allocated or legitimated. Humans now contest. That is the age we recognize all too well. You know that feeling when a family loses the one member everyone had quietly relied on to keep the peace, and suddenly every small resentment begins finding its own voice. Civilizations, it seems, can behave the same way. The source also notices changes in art and literature, and I think that is one of its strongest observations. Pre-departure, sacred imagery often depicts humans in strict subservience to divine beings. The scale difference is clear. The posture difference is clear. The world is hierarchically organized from above. But later, art shifts toward human-centered scenes. Rulers as individual achievers. Heroic campaigns. Political domination, personal glory. The famous victory imagery of later Mesopotamia does not wait patiently for gods to descend. It climbs upward toward power. That is not just aesthetics. That is anthropology. The human self becomes more prominent because the divine self has become more distant. And literature follows. The source gestures toward the Epic of Gilgamesh, and though the dating and compositional layers are complicated, the emotional fit is real. Gilgamesh is the great ancient story of a king forced to confront mortality in a world where immortality is no longer simply administered from above. He seeks. He fails. He grieves. He learns that walls, names, cities, and memory are the nearest equivalents many humans will ever get to permanence. If one wanted a literary monument to the age after direct divine rule, one could do much worse than Gilgamesh. Honestly, I have always felt that Gilgamesh belongs to the same wound as these departure texts. Different genre, yes. Different literary texture, certainly. But the same ache. The gods are still there, perhaps, but not near enough to save a friend from dying or a king from the knowledge of his own limits. Human greatness grows in the very space divine closeness once occupied. Religious practice adapts too, and this is where the source becomes almost moving in its respect for priestly creativity. When direct speech fails, people do not simply give up. They invent new ways to maintain connection. Divination changes. Extispicy grows more important. Heavenly signs are systematized. Prophetic traditions appear. Text-based authority becomes stronger. Instead of hearing the God in the room, one reads the will of heaven through patterns in livers, in stars, in formulas, in old texts copied and interpreted again and again. Religion survives, but it survives by becoming more mediated. That word matters. Mediated. The old world, as remembered in the source, is one of direct divine human contact. The new world is one of signs, councils, scribes, interpreters, and law. In a way, this is the beginning of history, as we usually understand it. Not history where gods are absent, but history where gods are no longer expected to manage every practical decision in immediate, tangible form. The source then broadens this transformation outward. It sees echoes of divine withdrawal themes in Egypt, among the Hittites, in Greek traditions of gods dwelling apart, in later northern myths of divine retreat, and eventually in broader religious systems that preserve heavenly sovereignty while accepting earthly distance. Some of these parallels are more suggestive than demonstrable. It is wise not to overpress them. But as a narrative gesture, they are effective. Mesopotamia becomes the first loud version of a pattern that may have haunted many cultures. The sense that there was once a closer age, and that human beings now live after it. That may be why later traditions often preserve stories of return. The source makes much of the paleo-contact interpretation at the end, suggesting that if advanced non-human beings once shaped early civilization, their withdrawal may have been planned, ethical, temporary, perhaps even educational. Humanity, on this reading, was left to develop independently after an initial phase of guidance. The promise of eventual return survives in many traditions because departure was never meant as total abandonment. It was a pause, or a test, or a transition. Some readers find that idea thrilling. Others hear in it the old human habit of moving our parents one level higher into the sky whenever adulthood becomes too difficult. I understand both reactions. There is a melancholy comfort in imagining that the silence is temporary, that the stars are not indifferent, that the gods or their analogues may come back when we have grown enough to meet them again. And yet, even if one leaves the extraterrestrial layer aside, the symbolic force remains. Every civilization must at some point confront the feeling that the world has been handed over to human responsibility, whether we wanted that responsibility or not. That is the mature sorrow at the heart of this story. The gods leave. The contracts continue. The fields still flood. The borders still need guarding. The dead still need burying. The laws still need writing. And there is no longer a luminous figure in the sanctuary, ready to tell us exactly how to proceed. I think that is why the final movement of the source carries such lingering weight. It is not really about proving one theory. It is about describing the dawn of a human condition, not humanity beginning biologically. Humanity beginning politically, morally, historically, in the sense that we now must live in the interval after direct certainty. If you were standing with me on the walls of one of those cities after the temple closures, perhaps at dusk, perhaps with the wind lifting a little dust along the parapet, you would see fields stretching outward, canals catching the last light, smoke rising from hearths, and beyond all of that, the old sky, still beautiful, still immense, still carrying the memory of disturbed stars. Below you, scribes are writing new codes. Priests are learning to interpret instead of hear. Rulers are claiming legitimacy through force, administration, and ambition rather than simple divine appointment. Soldiers are drilling. Merchants are counting weights. Children are learning signs from tablets in schools newly focused on human systems. The age after the gods has already begun. And perhaps the strangest part is that it works. Not perfectly, of course. Human rule is messy, pitié, more violent, more vulnerable to vanity and error. The source is right about that too. Territorial wars increase. Succession crises multiply. Theocratic certainty gives way to politics. But civilization does not collapse into nothing. It adapts. It builds. It legislates. It remembers. That too is important. The departure, however one reads it, does not end humanity. It forces humanity into fuller authorship. I have always found that both frightening and dignified. The source closes by carrying that tension all the way into the present. Modern archaeology uncovers more questions. Scientific techniques reveal new anomalies. UFO reports and paleocontact theories try to stitch the old testimonies into future-oriented narratives. The possibility of return lingers at the edge of thought. But even if no return ever comes, the legacy of that long-remembered withdrawal is already enormous. It shaped how humans think about law, mediation, authority, history, destiny, and the silence of heaven. There is one final image I want to leave with you before the story ends. Not a spaceship, not a glowing statue, not even a sealed chamber, A human hand pressing a law code into clay after the old direct speech has gone quiet. That hand trembles a little, perhaps, or perhaps it is very steady. Either way, it belongs to the new age. The age in which responsibility no longer descends fully formed, but must be written, argued, revised, and carried by people who still half remember a time when the gods themselves were said to have ruled. That hand is the real beginning of our world. So let the fire beside us sink down to embers now. Let the cities of Sumer dim into silhouettes. Let the temple roofs, the observation platforms, the sealed sanctuaries, the braziers, the inventories, the disturbed stars, and the grieving priests all settle into one long night of memory. The great ones depart, perhaps in skyboats, perhaps in story, perhaps in the symbolic language of a civilization processing a break too large to name directly. The result is the same. Humanity wakes into a quieter sky and has to learn how to govern itself beneath it. And still, even after all that, the promise of return lingers like a coal that refuses to go black. That may be the most human part of all. We keep building, legislating, fighting, farming, loving, and burying our dead in the silence left behind. Yet some part of us keeps glancing upward, as if the old roads of heaven might open again. Maybe they never will. Maybe the gods were always our language for a lost age of certainty. Or maybe, as the source dares to suggest, the departure was only temporary, and the long interval of human history is the middle passage of a much larger design. Either way, the night the gods left changed everything. It shortened kings. It emptied temples. It handed the burden of order to mortal hands. It turned religion into memory, law, sign, and hope. It made us human in a more difficult way, and if the old priests were right, if they truly watched the last lights ascend from the temple roof toward the star path, then somewhere beyond the dark we still live under the afterglow of that departure, trying to decide whether the silence above us is absence or only distance. Good night.